Hey there, Gotti. So, look, this isn't easy. You have over 1 million students, over 1,700 schools. Even in a normal year, it's difficult for kids to get back to school here in New York City. Now add a deadly pandemic onto that. School officials say they just need more time. New York City classrooms were supposed to open in just a few days, but now more than 1 million students will have to wait at least a week. The head of the city's principals union saying it just wouldn't be safe. The mayor insists he's committed to opening schools during the pandemic.
It's incredibly complex, but it can be done and it will be done.
Some parents reassured by the cautious approach.
If the teachers who take care of my children are not safe, I am more than happy to delay the start of school until the teachers, the staff, and the kids can all be in a safe place.
Others worry that city officials are struggling to come up with a plan.
I just think nobody knows what they're doing, and I don't have any ill will feelings towards the schools, because, you know, they're flying by the seat of their pants.
The delay comes after mounting concerns about ventilation in old school buildings and COVID testing protocols. There is also a critical staffing shortage. The mayor announcing 4,500 new hires to make up for it.
How difficult is it to hire thousands of new staff members and incorporate them into a school system last second?
It's impossible. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is not possible.
Megan Joninas is a music teacher in Brooklyn, but this year she is teaching 5th grade.
Could probably make it happen, but I'm a music teacher. Should I be making that happen? I don't think it's fair for anybody.
Right now, students in New York City, like many cities, are learning remotely. And even if some go back to actual classrooms, it won't be every day, putting a heavy burden on both teachers and parents.
The parents' families are supervising and instructing their children, whether they like it or not. And schools really have to work in partnership with them like they never did before.
The city released a public list of 56 confirmed cases of COVID in the 1,700 schools around the city. They are beginning mandatory testing starting in October for teachers and students.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.